Greetings to all of you. As director of the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore, I am delighted to welcome you and to make a few short welcoming comments to this webinar that is entitled Decoding the IPCC for Lawyers. As a lawyer myself, who does try and understand the very technical yet critical information contained in the IPCC assessment reports, I personally can attest to the value of such a webinar, and I'm so happy that this webinar is being presented. Indeed, while the IPCC does provide a very helpful summary for policymakers, in other words, for laypersons like myself, still, for those of us who are working in climate change, especially lawyers, we need to understand how to read and analyze the IPCC reports and what certain terms mean. As noted in the commentary to this webinar, the IPCC reports are also increasingly being used in domestic litigation for climate change. And now we have 3 advisory opinion requests at the international level. The Vanuatu Initiative, very recently adopted by the UN General Assembly by consensus, which is unprecedented for an advisory opinion. The request from the Commission on Small Island States, and also another request to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So these cases will need to present up-to-date scientific findings on climate change in a way that we can understand, the judges can understand, and the lawyers can understand in order to effectively present their cases. So today, we are absolutely so fortunate to have a great panel of experts. And this is an interdisciplinary panel. We have our scientist, Dr. Srivasan Raghavan, who is Deputy Director from the Tropical Marine Science Institute and also heads the Climate and Water Research Cluster. Also have my very dear friend, Professor Petra Minirab, who's also founder of the Durham University Center for Sustainable Development Law and Policy, with whom we collaborate on a regular basis. And very delighted to welcome Dr. Joyashree from the Asian Institute of Technology, and herself a member of the IPCC. She is an economist. I'm delighted also to welcome Elizabeth Wu from Client Earth. And of course, a special thank you to Danielle Yao, who leads our climate change law and policy program here, and our research associate, Rayla Punto, for putting this webinar together. And of course, I always have to thank the team, Jerry and Matthew, for providing the very important technical support. So I wish you all an excellent webinar. I know it's going to be very illuminating. So thank you so much, and Rayla, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nilofer, for that warm welcome and for setting the stage for our discussions today. So just as a brief introduction to our topic, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was created in 1998 by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Program to provide periodic assessments regarding the scientific basis of climate change, impacts, future risks, and opportunities for adaptation and mitigation. Founded before the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change itself, it has since then been the main source of consensus on the science and implications of climate change. The first IPCC assessment was published in 1990, and they most recently published the synthesis report for the 6th assessment last March. We are therefore very fortunate to have with us today 4 amazing panelists. So just an overview of our program for today, we have Dr. Joyashree Roy, who will talk about the work of the IPCC, give an overview of AR6, and provide a guide to the language of the IPCC. Dr. Srivasan Raghavan will then discuss the status of climate science, the missing gaps, and ways forward. After that, we will look into how climate science is being utilized in the legal practice and future opportunities for future collaboration. Professor Petra Minirab will talk about the role of climate science in COP decisions and climate litigation, both domestic and international, while Ms. Elizabeth Wu will give insight on the perspectives of the private sector and how climate science plays a role in corporate strategy and operation, investor corporate engagement, and climate action. Afterwards, we will have an interactive dialogue. And as I mentioned, I encourage everyone to send us your questions, if any, through the chat box below. So our first speaker for today is Dr. Jayashri Roy. Dr. Roy is the founding director of the Center on South and Southeast Asia Multidisciplinary Applied Research Network on Transforming Societies of Global South, and the inaugural Banga Bandhu Chair Professor at SIRD at the Asian Institute of Technology in Thailand. She is a former professor of economics and founding advisor of the Global Change Program and the SYLFF JU program at Jadavpur University in India. She has been involved with the IPCC since 2004 and was part of the IPCC 2007 Nobel Peace Prize winning panel. She was coordinating lead author of Working Group 3 for IPCC's 5th and 6th assessment reports, and is on the core writing team for the synthesis report of AR6. She's a celebrated and prolific author with more than 155 peer-reviewed journal articles, authored and edited books published. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jayashri Roy.
Hi, everybody. This is my pleasure that you invited me to speak in such a very special deliberation, because this is extremely important topic as we progress more and face more challenges in the human society due to climate change. As you have already said, Raila, rightly, that Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a UN body for assessing the science related to climate change. It was established by UNEP and the World Meteorological Organization in 1988 to provide policymakers with regular scientific assessments concerning climate change, its impacts, and potential future risks, as well as to put forward adaptation and mitigation strategies. It has 195 member states. The IPCC assessments provide governments at all levels with scientific information that they can use to develop climate policies. IPCC assessments are a key input into the international negotiations to tackle climate change. IPCC reports are drafted and reviewed in several stages, thus guaranteeing objectivity and transparency. The IPCC assesses the thousands of scientific papers published each year to tell policymakers what we know and do not know about the risks related to climate change. IPCC identifies where there is agreement in the scientific community. This is extremely important to understand as we progress. I will explain this further. There is agreement in the scientific community, and where is differences of opinion, and where further research is needed. It does not conduct its own research. To produce the reports, the IPCC mobilizes hundreds of scientists from member countries. Conscious choice to maintain diversity among scientists is an important step, and scientists volunteer their time to produce these reports. These scientists are drawn from diverse backgrounds. Only a dozen permanent staff work in the IPCC Secretariat. So reports are drafted and reviewed by external reviewers, including experts from scientific community, NGO community, and the government reviewers. In the interest of transparency, the drafts and review comments and author responses are all published once the report is finalized, and everything is available online from at least fourth assessment report, I think going even before that. So the report finalization, this is extremely important, happens after the summary for policymakers document is approved by the government delegates in an approval process. Approval process is all about improving the text as authors go through the document line by line with the government representatives. And these meetings are confidential discussions between government representatives and scientists, There are a number of complex issues that are usually discussed, but the IPCC is not at liberty to break that confidentiality. That means what goes on in the approval session, we usually do not talk, but the reports are finalized there. So what I would like to do is that I want to say that IPCC reports have actually influenced a number of decisions, for which I will just share my screen so that I can explain few more things. So you know that there has been a large number of IPCC reports which have been published. And but what I also want to show is that if you look into the first assessment report, which was published in 1990, that actually led to the formation of UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second assessment report provided the input for Kyoto Protocol. And third assessment report focused on attention of the impacts of climate change and need for adaptation. And fourth assessment report, which you know was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize, provided input for decision on 2 degrees Celsius limit and basis for post-Kyoto Protocol agreement. And fifth assessment report provided input for the Paris Agreement. And the sixth assessment report is going to be extremely important for the next stock take, which is going to happen in 2023. And that's why these reports attract attention of the governments, and they scrutinize each and every word what is being written, because they will be used in the negotiation material. And as I heard in the beginning, that actually the local governments are also, or local litigation and legal actions are also using the IPCC report. So they are becoming mostly, more and more important. And that's why governments take very careful attention to each word what is being written. And so what I'm trying to say is that 6 assessment cycle has been actually extremely important in the sense that never before in such a short time of 7 years, we produced so many reports. Usually we prepare 3 reports: Working Group 1, Working Group 2, and Working Group 3. Working Group 1 is physical science basis, Working Group 2 is climate change impact and vulnerability, and Working Group 3 is mitigation of climate change, and the synthesis report. So each cycle actually produces these 4 reports, but 6 assessment cycle, we actually produced even other reports like the special report of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which got published in 2018, and then ocean and cryosphere report and the land use report. And there was facilitation of the Talanawa dialogue by using the 1.5 special report. So it was extremely important, extremely busy, this 6 assessment cycle for all of us. So what I would say is that if we, there are so many things in the report, but let me just highlight some of the things which we have tried to bring forward for 6 assessment report through the synthesis report. So this is very clear now. When we say very clear, we say that scientifically this has very high confidence. So with very high confidence, science can see this. What does this high confidence mean? I'll come later, but I'm just showing you all the high confidence statements which are based on this assessment. And this says that pace and scale of climate action is insufficient to tackle climate change. Right now, whatever is happening, there are many things happening, but then the pace and scale falls short of what is needed to handle the climate change. And if we are not doing enough, then it means that these adverse impacts caused by human-caused climate change will impact the water resources and health and well-being, and also cities, settlement and infrastructure, and the ecosystem structure are going to be adversely impacted. And it's very high confident, again, that most likely that extreme events are going to be widespread and pronounced with every increment of warming. And this is of one very important reason for concern in the human society. But what is also true that there is hope that there are actually several actions which can be taken to reduce loss and damages for both for nature and the people. So climate action, if taken, that has many co-benefits like health benefit, air pollution benefit, etc. And also what is needed is that multiple feasible effective options, the assessment report shows, can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and help in adapting to human-caused climate change. These are extremely important because these are very high confidence statements. I'll come back to what does it mean by high confidence statements. And also what is important that this time in the sixth assessment report, this became very clear that that fairness is one of the solution, which means that the climate change is very unfair. This has become very clear in the sense that those who contribute to climate change, they are not vulnerable. The vulnerables are contributing almost nothing to the climate change. So this is extremely important to understand. And millions are exposed to food insecurity and water insecurity. And biggest impacts are going to be in parts of Africa, Asia, Central and South America, least developed countries, and small islands and Arctic region. And what we are saying is that in these vulnerable regions, people are going to be 15 times more likely to die of floods, droughts, and storms compared to the most resilient areas. And the sixth assessment report has also come up very clearly that the climate finance can do all these advancement in action, but then there is 3 to 6 times more financial flow need to happen in the climate action. There is global finance, but they are not moving towards the climate action. And developing countries require more external funding for meeting their adaptation and mitigation needs. And options are available, but they are not accelerating at a rate which is needed. So what we are saying is that what are the enablers which enables these actions? So political commitment, inclusive governance, international cooperation, effective ecosystem stewardship, sharing of diverse knowledge. But another thing I would say is that actually in the working group 3 report, we could show that wherever the climate law is implemented, the climate actions have progressed faster. So this we are highlighting more and more to say that how political commitment can increase if law plays a very important role, both nationally and internationally. And now what I would like to show is that basically what we are showing, this is a chart, but before I go to this, what I want to say is that whatever I have showed so far is showing that what this assessment tells with high confidence and high probability. So what is this high confidence and high probability? When we are making an assessment, we are collecting all the research publications which have happened, and then as experts, we make a judgment whether there is an agreement among the scientific documents or there is disagreement. So when there is high agreement and very large number of evidence, so robust evidence and high agreement among the scientists, then we say that there is high confidence, very high confidence in that statement. So whatever I showed you are actually very high confidence statements. But also we try to report some of the assessments which may not be high confidence, which means that there may be high agreement, but there is limited evidence. Say maybe 5-6 scientific papers are only saying that there is going to be massive flooding or massive, say, for example, forest fire due to climate change. So maybe there is limited evidence from across the world, but there may be high agreement. But that will emerge as a medium confidence statements, because high agreement but low evidence means medium confidence statements. So level of confidence that we attach to each of the statement has to do with whether there is agreement among the scientists or there is more disagreement among the scientists, or is there low evidence or limited evidence or medium evidence. So it is high confidence and low confidence doesn't mean that whether that event will happen or not happen, but it is about whether scientific evidences are more and whether there is agreement or disagreement. Say, for example, if in some places, it says that some of the literature says that with dietary shift towards non-meat products, some pastoral community will lose their employment. But this is not coming from all the countries. Some countries, they can still shift the jobs to other sectors, so they are not losing job. But in some countries, there is lack of preparedness, there is lack of policy, so they cannot immediately shift from the job. So there is disagreement among the scientists in terms of observed fact. So that will be reported in IPCC report as medium agreement, but high evidence. So that will mean there is medium confidence. So there is not high confidence statement, but it doesn't mean that it will not happen, right? So there is either disagreement or there is less evidence. So that is something which is about the confidence level. These confidence statements are used mostly in the adaptation literature assessment and the mitigation literature assessment. But what we do is also we use probabilistic statements. Say, for example, we are saying that extreme weather events are most likely to happen, which means that it can happen with 99 to 100% probability. So it is now understood scientifically that extreme weather events like very hot days, very cold days, very heavy precipitation, a hailstorm, all these things can happen with higher frequency and higher intensity is with 99 to 100% probability. So there is agreement now within the scientific community with very high probability that extreme weather events are going to happen. Flood is going to happen more intensively. So that is how we each statement we write in the summary for policymaker is qualified by whether this is a high probability or there is high confidence. Probability is where we can quantify, and high confidence is where expert judgment has to be made. But again, I said those uncertainty statements are used following this tabular form. So these are all available online, this information. As I said, transparency is the strength of IPCC reports. So this is something extremely important, so that when we interpret each of these, they need to be looked through the probability statement and the confidence statements. Also, what I want to say is that the strength of IPCC report is how many people write it, right? So working group 1, physical science basis, for the 6th assessment report, actually 234 authors from all over the world from 65 countries contributed, and men and women ratio you can see. And what, as I said, anyone can register themselves to review these when the process is going on. So 78,000 comments we had to respond to. So you can see how rigorously these are reviewed. Sorry. Also, what is important to understand that 6th assessment report working group 2 was written by 270 authors. And working group 3 report was written by 278 authors. So this is extremely important to understand that IPCC reports are authenticated and cross-checked by scientists and reviewers from all over the world, so that they make less mistake, not less mistake, they're error-free, and they are stated with high confidence and high probability statements. So I'll stop here, and anything you want to come back, I'll be there to respond to. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roy. That was certainly very informative, and thank you for giving us an insider view to the IPCC process and the results of the AR6. The results are definitely striking, but at least I, for one, am very grateful of hearing you say that there is still hope. And thank you as well for clarifying the language that the IPCC reports use, especially for the lawyers who might not be quite familiar with this. And for those who want to read further on the report, I shared the link on the chat box. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Srivatsan Raghavan. Dr. Raghavan is the Deputy Director of the NUS Tropical Marine Science Institute, which he joined in 2008 after obtaining his PhD from the University College London. He currently holds a joint appointment with the Department of Geography at NUS, where he teaches courses related to weather and climate change. He's also a core researcher at the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions at NUS, and he has been the lead climate modeler for several climate change projects commissioned at TMSI. Apart from climate research, Dr. Srivatsan has also been involved in climate impact studies over Southeast Asia on topics such as hydrology, crop modeling, and food security. May I please welcome Dr. Srivatsan Raghavan.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Raila. Thanks so much for making me a part of this webinar. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, so taking along what Professor Joy mentioned, that's the IPCC sort of fundamentals. And one of the points that I want to make here is when we want to make stronger climate actions, make stronger policies, I think we need a superior coordinating body in our region. And when we meet with scientists for the IPCC or something, one of the points which is normally brought up is like few studies on core climate science or from climate impacts from this region compared to the others, either in the West or the US or the European nations, Australia, somewhere. So I think this is a limitation we have here. And if we want to make IPCC stronger or to work towards stronger climate policies, I think you need to make a stronger institutional capacity building, which should actually take more universities closely working with the institutes or the organizations. And I think that's the first step in making climate policy stronger, because we're going to talk about law and how that's going to make climate policy stronger. How do we efficiently work towards mitigation and to be in line with the Paris Agreement? So that's the big question. We know that some of them are already being carried on, and yes, and one of the points is that we need stronger policies, stronger policy implementation, which can be closely followed by a tighter institution and to bring more people into this network. So let me pause here, and then probably we will go around and come back, and I will have more points to discuss. So over to you, Raila. I'll come back again.
Thank you, Dr. Shri. So now we will go to Professor Minirop. Professor Minirop will lead the discussion on how climate science is used in the legal practice and the opportunities to strengthen future collaboration. Professor Minirop is the director of the Center for Sustainable Development Law and Policy and a professor of international law at the Durham University Law School. She's also the academic lead of Durham University for the UNFCCC engagement and climate change. She previously also served as the co-director of the Global Policy Institute, and she has published widely on liability in international environmental law, climate protection agreements, climate litigation, human rights, the classification and status of states under international law, and an EU citizenship. May I please welcome Professor Miller.
Thank you very much, Raya, and also Nilofer colleagues. Thank you so much for inviting me to this very important webinar. And it's a great honor to be here with you today. And also warm greetings to the audience. Now, you've given me a very broad brief, Raya, and I will do my best to cover all of that in 15 or 20 minutes. I would like to focus my comments on 3 main points. Firstly, the use of science in international instruments, and there I will concentrate on a few COP decisions and there discuss how the IPCC reports have been used in these cover decisions. And in that context, I would like to touch upon the role of scientific recommendations as per the ICJ's jurisprudence. And secondly, I will address the potential use of science and law within the doctrine of European consensus of the ECTHR. Very timely, we see now 12 cases pending there or before the court, according to the Sabin Center search engine. Thirdly, I would like to draw your attention to the use of the IPCC reports in 2 landmark decisions at the domestic level, and that is Neubauer in Germany and Mille Defensi in Dutch Shell. And I would like to conclude with a few remarks around the role that attribution science could play, and something that the Philippine Human Rights Commission had to say in that respect. Now, first of all, the use of science or the status of the IPCC reports, as you ask, under international law. Now, when reading the COP decisions, it is possible to see an enhanced focus of parties on the role of science and the urgency of action. And this is so the case from the standpoint of treaty interpretation. So I will come back to that. In the interest of time, I would like to focus on 4 COP cover decisions. Now, at COP24, parties welcomed the timely completion of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius in response to the invitation from parties in Decision 1 CP21. So that was the decision that adopted the Paris Agreement. Now, those of you who were there and who were part of the negotiations know how very contested this issue was, and it was almost like the lowest common denominator to just welcome the timely completion. Now, at COP25, then the COP expressed its appreciation and gratitude to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the scientific community for providing the 2019 special reports, which reflect, according to the COP, the best available science, and the COP encouraged parties to continue to support the work of the IPCC. Now, we see here an enhanced focus on the role of the IPCC and more appreciation of their work as well. COP26 then changed this again, where the CMA3 and the COP26 cover decisions both state that they welcome the contribution of Working Group 1 to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report and the recent global and regional reports on the state of the climate from the World Meteorological Organization. And the IPCC was also invited to present its forthcoming reports to the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice in 2022. The COP also expressed alarm and utmost concern that human activities have caused around 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming to date. Now, at COP27, and this is a bit of a disputed COP decision, especially the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan, whether or not it has increased the focus on the science or not. I think it has increased the focus on the science even further. Now, at the beginning of the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan, you can see in the one of the very first preambular paragraphs that the COP is guided by science and principles. And then there is, for the first time, a self-standing section on science and urgency. And there the COP and the CMA welcome the contributions of Working Group 2 and 3 to the 6th Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They recognize the importance of the best available science for effective climate action and policy making, take note of the 2022 Adaptation Gap and Emission Gap reports, but then also continue to reiterate that the impacts of climate change will be much lower at the temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius compared with 2 degrees Celsius. And the COP resolves to further pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And also for the first time, the cryosphere is mentioned here. The COP recognizes the impacts of climate change on the cryosphere and the need for further understanding of these impacts, including of tipping points. So going back now to international law, so how can we use these enhanced focus, if we agree that there is one, in these decisions to play a role in international law? Now, decisions that are adopted within the framework of a conference of state parties can provide non-exclusive range of practical options for implementing the treaty. The conference of parties is a hybrid institution within a treaty, a lawmaking treaty. It's not set up under the treaty, but it is of course a regular review meeting that can give these guidance on the implementation of the treaty. Now, the International Law Commission, in its draft conclusions on subsequent agreements and subsequent practice in relation to the interpretation of treaties in 2018, found that a decision adopted within the framework of a conference of state parties embodies a subsequent agreement or subsequent practice in the sense of Article 31, paragraph 3 of the Vienna Convention on the Interpretation of Treaties, insofar as it expresses agreement in substance between the parties regarding the interpretation of the treaty, regardless of the form and the procedure by which the decision was adopted, including an adoption by consensus. So the specific legal effect of a decision will depend on the rules of procedure of the Conference of State Parties, but also on the treaty. But on that basis, it is possible to at least discuss how the increasing appreciation for IPCC reports and its findings, especially around the need to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, could be interpreted as a subsequent agreement of parties to use the reports in the interpretation of Article 2.1a, the temperature band of the Paris Agreement. And here one could interpret then the COP decision as an embodiment of an agreement that at least shifts the emphasis of parties to the lower point of the temperature scale based on the latest science, and perhaps also to support that states have understood that every increment matters. So it's not just this dichotomy between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. There are also figures in between these 2 points, and every increment matters. Now, there's perhaps then a further argument to support this, and this stems from the jurisprudence of the ICJ. It is very difficult to make any predictions about the approach of the ICJ to the request that was just made to it to deliver an advisory opinion. So I will keep clear of that, but maybe the specific question of how the ICJ has treated scientific evidence, I would like to draw your attention to the decision of whaling in the Antarctic. And in that case, the International Court of Justice held that with respect to the role of the International Whaling Commission under the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, that the Commission may from time to time make recommendations to any or all contracting governments on any matters which relate to whaling and the scientific research on it. And these recommendations, which take the form of resolutions, are not binding. However, when they are adopted by consensus or by unanimous vote, they may be relevant for the interpretation of the convention or its schedule. So this confirms the assumption made above that the COP decisions that reference the IPCC and include a tighter focus on 1.5 degrees Celsius could be seen as shifting the focus to the lower end of the temperature range of the Paris Agreement. Now, the ECTHR then. The ECTHR Human Rights European Court of Human Rights has a very special instrument that is even dedicated to trace scientific evidence, at least in the latest case law. Now, the ECTHR has famously classified the convention as a living instrument. The nature of human rights protection is very much that this is perpetual work in progress. Now, the doctrine of European consensus concretizes states' obligations under the ECHR and limits the margin of appreciation that states have. So in the more recent case law, we can observe that the ECTHR has used science as a point of departure for finding a European consensus. It establishes in a comparative legal approach then across the member states' jurisdictions and international law instruments how the science has been incorporated into legal instruments. A European consensus can then exist on that basis on either the interest at stake or on the means to protect the interest on both of these elements. So in cases that are open to a scientific discussion, such as the definition of the beginning of life or in vitro fertilization, the ECTHR has increasingly found that a scientific and a legal consensus must exist, either on this interest at stake or on the means to protect it. And either one can also already limit the state's discretion in finding the correct human rights standard. So it will be interesting to see, as we navigate now the legal response to the climate crisis, how the ECTHR will deal with the scientific evidence and the legal measures that states have already adopted. And I think here again, we could make the argument that there is already a scientific and a legal consensus on at least the interest at stake. Perhaps not yet on the means to protect the interest at stake, but as I said before, even a consensus on the interest at stake could already narrow the margin of appreciation. Turning now to domestic litigation and just giving you a few points that we maybe can take up in the discussion further. One key case, which I think has a lot contributed to advancing climate action in Germany, is the case of Neubauer and Germany. I will make 3 points about the judgment that are perhaps not as much discussed yet, and that also relate to the topic of how the IPCC was relevant here. Now, the court described the task of the IPCC to present the state of scientific research on climate change in a comprehensive and objective manner, providing a basis for science-based decisions. And to this end, it compiles the results of the scientific evidence, as we've just heard so expertly described. It does not conduct research itself, but rather summarizes the key findings of these publications in assessment reports and special reports, and evaluates, then comes to a scientific perspective. So the court really very well summarized this. It also explained that the Paris Agreement was adopted on the basis of scientific findings compiled in preparation for the Paris Climate Change Conference. Now then, the court found that the legislator is not entirely free in how it specifies the obligation to take climate action under Article 20A of the Basic Law, which is a state objective that demands of the state to protect the natural foundations of life for the present and for future generations. Instead, the court used the IPCC and the science provided for a carbon budget approach. Before I come back to that, I will just mention as well that the court found that currently it is correct for the legislator to use the Paris Agreement's temperature target to identify the target under national law. However, the court also said that it would be possible, if there were new evidence, to have an even tighter target than the one under the Paris Agreement. And that also Germany would have an international or national obligation for the international level to work towards a tighter target, should this be necessary. So how was the temperature limitation used as a constitutional yardstick? The court used the global carbon budget approach, and on that basis, it confirmed that the National Advisory Committee had calculated a national carbon budget. So in order to perform this conversion, there were 2 steps to be fulfilled. The first one was to ascertain the amount of global emissions that can still be produced if the temperature is to be kept within a specific limit. And then the second step was to determine how much of this was attributable to Germany. And this was then the remaining national carbon budget. And for the definition of the size of the carbon budget, the court relied again on the IPCC and the numerical figures, quantifying the size of the remaining global budget for different temperature limits, and on the calculations of the National Advisory Committee. And here the court found that in basing the remaining national budget on a 1.75 degrees Celsius temperature limit, the Advisory Council did not take a particularly stringent approach, but the legislator had also not at present overstepped the scope of the decision-making, given the range of the Paris Agreement and the temperature band. So here again, it's you can see how these 2 different levels of the legal order could work together if it were possible to say states have adopted a closer emphasis on the lower limit, on the 1.5 degrees Celsius, then it would be very difficult for the Constitutional Court to continue with this kind of relatively broad approach, saying that 1.75 degrees Celsius is still an acceptable temperature target for modeling the national climate target. And the final point I would like to make in this respect is also scientific uncertainties. The court understood the IPCC's scientific uncertainties as going into both directions. So the carbon budget could be larger or smaller. And I think this is perhaps something where lawyers and scientists need to work more closely together to understand, is this really the case, or is it not the case that in hindsight we always exceed even the upper limits of these uncertainties. Merely defensive, very similar in the sense of using the IPCC, found similarly to Neubauer that the goals of the Paris Agreement are derived from the IPCC reports. It used then the special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius that showed that only reduction pathways aiming for a net 25% reduction of CO2 emissions in 2030 relative to 2010 levels yield a 50% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then the court, of course, this was very novel, applied something to which a state, here in this case the Netherlands, had agreed to a corporation, to a private company, to say that they also have the same duty of care to arrive at these emission reductions. Now, I realize this is a lot of case law that is of course missing. We can cover much more. One final case is the case that could be relevant for attribution science, and with that I will come to my concluding remarks. So attribution science, based on what we already understand from climate science more generally, carries this promise of now being a game changer for causal analysis in the law. So attribution or event attribution science in particular reveal how we can attribute a certain specific climate-related impact to a specific emitter or source of emissions, at least a defined region that emits in a certain way, and also historically. And one case where this could be tested could be the case of LEA and RWE concerning the attribution of an increased flood hazard to the greenhouse gas emissions of RWE, the biggest German energy provider. And this is, of course, a case that is situated in the Andes, and it's concerning the glacial lake, Lake Palcacocha, but it's still a case that is being dealt with by the Higher Court of Appeal in Hamm in Germany. Now, there is in that context perhaps a very interesting statement of the Republic of the Philippines Commission of Human Rights, and this is one of the very limited judicial pronouncements that we have in terms of using attribution science in a legal context. There hasn't really been a case that has made or has adjudicated a case based on attribution, event attribution science alone yet. But the Philippines Commission found in its final report in 2022 on the National Inquiry on Climate Change that in many jurisdictions, courts evaluate evidence linking actors to climate-related losses using the very stringent standards of legal causation. And according to the Commission, this disregards the work of climate and attribution science and causes more climate injustices. The Commission then proceeds with recommendations for the judiciary and to recommend to judges to establish whether the likelihood or strength of a natural event has changed in the observational record and whether this change is consistent with the anthropogenic influence as found in one or more climate models. And it doesn't specify whether these use the storytelling approach or a more deductive approach of probabilistic counterfactual attribution science. So this is a very distinct statement that we haven't seen in any domestic or international court yet, but it's also very promising to at least open the discussion about how do we use these yardsticks or these stringent legal tests of but for and conditio sine qua non when we are using attribution science, and also to think about whether or not we really always have applied in court situations these tests to the same stringency or the same standards as we do now often in climate change. I will end with this, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Minirov. It's certainly encouraging that at least decision makers, policymakers, and even the courts are increasingly relying on climate science, and it's going to be very exciting to see what happens as we look forward to the ICJ cases and the ITLOS cases, as well as all the other climate cases that are pending worldwide. So now I will turn to our last speaker for today, Ms. Elizabeth Thu. Elizabeth Thu is a legal consultant at the international environmental NGO Client Earth. Elizabeth works with the private sector, civil society, and government regulators on climate-related risks and opportunities in Asia, and leads on initiatives that explore the role of corporate law and investment and trade law to facilitate the transition to a net zero carbon economy. Her research covers the intersection and alignment of international climate and environmental law with international investment and trade law, with a particular focus on ASEAN-related multilateral and bilateral treaties. May I please welcome Ms. Thu.
A very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Raila, and thanks so much to Nilofer, Danielle, Jerry, and Matthew at CRL for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. I also want to thank my fellow panelists. I learned so much from them, and I look forward to the discussion later. I'm very pleased to be providing some comments on private sector perspectives in climate science and investor and corporate initiatives. So changing course to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with no limited offshoot will require deep greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the near term. In modeled pathways that limit global warming to this goal, greenhouse gas emissions peak immediately and before 2025 at the latest. They then drop rapidly, declining 43% by 2030 and 60% by 2035 relative to 2019 levels. So it's quite clear that drastic action will be needed. As stated by the Singapore Exchange in its paper on credible decarbonization and transition for corporates in Asia, there is a clear role for the corporate sector to support the goals of the Paris Agreement to reduce emissions. Further, at the most ambitious level, quantitative targets should be aligned with the IPCC's 1.5 degrees Celsius, no and low overshoot scenarios. So how exactly should corporates develop plans to take into account pathways that limit global warming based on climate science? Well, one of the more significant guidance tools for corporates on science-based targets is developed by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. This is a partnership between the Carbon Disclosure Project, the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature. The SBTi defines minimum qualitative and quantitative criteria for corporates, and 4,000 businesses around the world are already working with the SBTi. Most companies follow a 5-step process to set science-based targets. The first entails committing, so you establish an intent to set a science-based target. Second, you develop an emissions reduction target in line with SBTi's criteria. Third, this target is then presented to the SBTi for validation, and validation is then done by SBTi's independent technical experts. Fourthly, there is an announcement of this target to stakeholders, and the fifth is to disclose and report company-wide emissions and track target progress annually. So the SBTs should cover a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 10 years from the date the target is submitted to the SBTi for validation. Emissions reductions from scope 1 and 2 sources must be aligned with 1.5 pathways. But if the company has significant scope 3 emissions that account for over 40% of total company emissions, then a target covering at least 2/3 of that scope of emissions is required. Targets must also be reviewed and, if necessary, recalculated and revalidated every 5 years. What is notable is that carbon credits and avoided emissions do not count towards these targets. So on the slide is an example of one of SBTi's validation criteria from its target validation protocol for near-term targets that was recently revised in March 2023. So if you can see the example, companies here are required to submit targets at the parent company level, not at the subsidiary level. And companies must include emission from all subsidiaries in their submissions. As for oil and gas companies, the SBTi is reviewing its methodology and guidance for this, and it will not currently validate targets for companies with any level of direct involvement in exploration, extraction, mining, or the production of oil, natural gas, coal, or other fossil fuels, regardless of percentage revenue generated by these activities. It will also not validate for companies that derive 50% or more of their revenue from the sale, transmission, and distribution of fossil fuels, or by providing equipment or services to fossil fuel companies. And it will not accept commitments from such companies and has removed previous commitments. So I just want to move then to an initiative from the private sector that does look at fossil fuel companies amongst other high emitting companies. And such companies are receiving attention from institutional investor-led initiatives. Now, one of the most significant such engagement initiatives by investors with companies on climate change is Climate Action 100+. This is an investor-led initiative to ensure that the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emissions take necessary action on climate change. CA100+ references the IPCC special report on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius that calculates that a 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming trajectory will require a worldwide reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of about 45% by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. Now, this initiative focuses on 166 focused companies, of which 34 are in Asia. And these companies account for 80% of corporate industrial greenhouse gas emissions. It was launched in 2017 by 5 regional investor networks and 5 investor representatives. These networks are grouped by geographical regions. So, for example, AIGCC is the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change and is the Asia-focused network. The investors that make up CA100+ comprise investors that are responsible for over $68 trillion of assets under management and represent over 50% of all global assets under management. So the CA100+ initiative has 3 broad asks that investors make of companies. The first is strengthen the governance framework for climate risk. The second is greenhouse gas emissions reductions in line with Paris Agreement goals. And the third is TCFD and sector-specific corporate disclosure. Now, these asks are high-level agenda, very much best practices, and investors are encouraged to identify more detailed company-specific expectations and actively communicate with companies on these. CA100+ also tracks focus companies' performance on net zero transition. So its disclosure framework indicators evaluate the adequacy of corporate disclosure. So, for example, disclosure of whether short, medium, and long-term targets limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius with low or no overshoot in 2050. This is equivalent to the IPCC special report on a 1.5 Celsius pathway, path 1, or the IEA's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. In line with the IPCC special report or the IEA scenario, the relevant year for long-term alignment for electric utility companies is 2040 and not 2050. C100+ alignment assessments also evaluate the alignment of company actions with the Paris Agreement goals. So for instance, the alignment assessment for electric utilities includes whether the company's 5-year capacity plans for applicable technologies are consistent with the IEA's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario at an aggregate level. Now, this is a new benchmark which was released in March 2023, and assessments of companies using the benchmark will be released in September or October of 2023. So C100+ engagement is spearheaded by a lead investor or investors, and they work cooperatively with a number of collaborating investors to formulate these various asks of companies. Engagement can be through private engagement or public engagement. So for example, shareholder resolutions on climate change or voting in relation to directors. Shareholder climate-related resolutions have become increasingly important globally as a means for investors and companies to communicate in relation to climate targets. So a climate-related resolution is understood broadly as any resolution that relates to the climate directly or indirectly, and even shareholder resolutions which do not explicitly mention the word climate may have an impact on the climate. The slide shows some non-exhaustive examples, and such resolutions can include the development by the company of a Paris-aligned strategy with short, medium, and long-term goals, or disclosure by the company of details of their climate and energy policy lobbying. These resolutions can be based on Climate Action 100+'s disclosure and alignment benchmarks. So there are obviously a number of interesting shareholder climate resolutions around the world, and I just provide a taste of some of these on this slide. One perhaps rather notable one is that at ExxonMobil 2022 AGM, this was an example of a successful resolution that requested an audited report outlining how the International Energy Agency's modeling for a net zero economy by 2050 would affect various assumptions and estimates underlying ExxonMobil's financial statements. The board recommended voting against this resolution, but notwithstanding, the resolution passed with 52% shareholder support. In Asia, there has also been increasing regulatory support for corporate climate engagement. On the slide, there are examples of stewardship codes from Korea, Japan, and Singapore. And what is interesting is that these codes support increased mid to long-term corporate value and engagement, as well as constructive and purposeful engagement by investors with companies on these particular climate and environmental issues. Now, Japan is a jurisdiction in Asia where there is increasing investor corporate climate engagement on climate-specific targets. This slide shows the examples of the progression of shareholder climate resolutions in Japan from 2020 to date. I just want to highlight one set of notable resolutions in 2022. For the first time, institutional investors brought shareholder climate resolutions in Japan, and these were filed at J-Power, an electric utility in Japan. The filing group was a US $3 trillion institutional investor group comprising Amundi, Europe's largest asset manager, Man Group, one of the world's largest publicly listed hedge fund companies, and HSBC Asset Management. They co-filed the resolutions with ACCR, a research and shareholder advocacy organization. The second and third of these resolutions are particularly interesting because they concern the reporting of alignment of capital expenditure plans with emissions reduction targets and reporting on how remuneration policies will incentivize progress on emissions reduction targets. Now, these resolutions received between 18% to 26% shareholder support. And even if they weren't passed, the fact that there was a not insubstantial proportion of shareholders that voted in favor is a signaling force to show concern that shareholders have with climate risk. So let me just finish off briefly with some other private sector initiatives that are supportive of climate science-based targets in Asia. The first is the Asian Utilities Engagement Program started in June 2021 by AIGCC, the Asia Focus Group of Climate Action 100+. Now, the Asian electric utility sector is critical to the net zero transition as it contributes to approximately 23% of global carbon dioxide emissions. This particular program consists of 17 institutional investors and stewardship service providers and include Amundi, BNP Paribas Asset Management, GIC, and UOB Asset Management. 7 focus utilities have been identified for engagement, and AIGCC reports that the focus company CLP has made a 2050 net zero commitment with a commitment to phase out coal by 2040. AIGCC's focus continues to be on an implementation and a comprehensive approach to financing a just transition away from fossil fuels. The second AIGCC-related initiative is guidance published by AIGCC and Client Earth for investors on shareholder climate resolutions in Asia. This guide brings together the views of 11 top corporate law experts across 11 Asian jurisdictions, and they chart the legal landscape for shareholder climate resolutions based on climate targets in their respective jurisdictions. This is not legal advice, but rather it is a resource for Asia-focused investors who are considering engaging with companies through shareholder resolutions based on climate targets. It complements broader engagement options within a specific local context as part of responsible stewardship by investors on climate matters. Finally, I just want to highlight the GFAN's APAC workstream on the managed phase-out of coal power generation in APAC. The GFANS is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, a global coalition of leading financial institutions that are committed to accelerating the decarbonization of the economy. GFANS APAC is based in Singapore and supported by the Singapore Exchange, Temasek, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore. GFANS APAC is developing voluntary guidance on the managed phase-out of coal power generation to provide clarity for net zero committed financial institutions, and this is intended to be published in 2023. Now, the workstream is driven by financial institutions, but also involves other knowledge partners from across civil society. Client Earth is the legal knowledge partner for this workstream and is working alongside technical knowledge partners and partners on areas such as climate finance. The output of this workstream is for a report that contains practical voluntary guidance detailing what a credible, viable, and inclusive phase-out could look like. This includes credibility of the transition at portfolio and plant-specific levels based on transition pathways, and financial levers for such phase-out, so equity and debt structures, as well as considerations of a just transition. The hope is to provide clarity on the managed phase-outs and also build alignment across various key stakeholders, financial institutions, philanthropies, civil society, and the private and public sector on a credible approach to managed coal phase-out. So that concludes briefly my presentation, and I very much look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Liu, for giving us a glimpse at how the private sector is using climate science and aligning with the Paris goals. That's certainly very encouraging, especially with what we just heard with the daunting results of AR6, and of course, the necessity for a whole of society approach to climate action. So if I may now welcome back all our panelists, if you can turn on your video once again. We have received a couple of advanced questions from our attendees, and I once again invite our audience to use the chat box or the Q&A box for additional questions. And of course, if the panelists, if you want to ask each other questions as well, you're welcome that. I'll use my moderator privilege to ask the first set of questions. And if I could turn over to our scientists in the panel once again. So there have been some criticism on how, as you mentioned, Dr. Roy, that there is a part of the process of the IPCC that is closed door, wherein government officials are discuss and approve the reports. So I guess one of my questions would be, how can we further avoid politicizing the IPCC process and ensure transparency and inclusivity? And then further to that, like, what can the legal profession do to encourage science-based policymaking and fight the proliferation of fake news? So Dr. Roy can start, and then perhaps
Yeah.
Dr. Ragavan can follow.
Right. So basically, let us understand that this closed door meeting happens only for the summary for policymaker. But for the whole report is produced over 6 years and in three different time points, like the draft 1, draft 2, and draft 3. These are sent out to the larger community for commenting on. So they are scientists, non-IPCC scientists, experts, and anyone. Like even you all who are concerned about, who take interest in IPCC science can provide comments, and those will be responded scientifically. But remember, this is Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change. So governments have made a request for this scientific body, and they have formed this scientific body to inform the government for scientific facts which they can use for policymaking. So the mandate is to provide unbiased scientific evidence. It's not about politics, right? So it's about providing unbiased scientific evidence. We need to provide not policy prescription, we provide recommendations, we give options, and it is the political parties or the governments to decide which action suits their purpose. So when I said that summary for policymaker is approved line by line, word by word, the reason is it is in the mandate that IPCC need to co-produce the science. So every government has the right to understand what do we mean by a particular scientific statement. So this is like, like a PhD student's defense. So you have the right to ask all the questions so that you make sure that science is maintained with its integrity. So it's not about politicization, but it is about understanding the science in their own language. So I would not say that it is about politics taking over science, but how science can inform everybody. And so how we can interpret, as we are saying that how for the legal person, how they can interpret high confidence, high probability statements. So that's also something which governments want to understand, right? It's their time. So their time, they want that time exclusively with the scientists so that they can understand what the science has said and they understand each and every word, because they have to go back and they have to explain and implement in their territories, depending on understanding the science. So they clarify these questions. And because it's intergovernmental, so they take that exclusive time for themselves. So that's why I said the confidentiality.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. Dr. Shi, if you could also expound on that, and the second question of how we lawyers and the legal profession can encourage science-based policymaking and fight the fake news.
Yeah, I think I should agree with Dr. Roy, and then take this main comment is that when we have more confidence in climate change from the models, from the science, and from what the IPCC has given in its volumes of material, and from the literature, that is enough evidence that they need some climate action. So once we translate the science to the lawyers and say, okay, there's clear evidence, now it's up to you to convince the policymakers that something should be done. So I believe that there is good understanding about this for the lawyers, but from the other side, on implementing it, I'm sure there are some bottlenecks. So the next stage goes to how it's going to be implemented. And implementation comes with a lot of these bottlenecks in sort of, you see, like this auditing, or how do you take this? It's a long process, long chain of things. For example, if you take the Paris Agreement and the NDCs, and then every 5 years is going to be audited, and you have to report to the panel to say, okay, what is my contribution, and so on and so on and so on. If you get into the modalities and the framework of how this should be implemented, and that's where you get bottlenecks. So the overall picture of getting to do something is clear. But when you get into each of these, like if it's an application form, like each one you have stages and stages in implementation, then there's bottlenecks to say what qualifies for this, what qualifies for that, where is that agreeable, where is that not agreeable. So there's no one cap such fits all kind of thing. So the lawyers have to sort of assess and see, okay, is there something that can combine? Is there something which can simplify? And for the policymaker to take and say, yeah, sure, we can do this, rather than complicating it. So some of these terms, the jargon, the way that's written, all these sometimes it really bewilders people from getting to do something. So one sort of thinking is like, how can we simplify the framework and to take it to the grassroots and say, okay, this can be done. We have simplified it. There's a simple modality, simple framework, start with something. And then it can be built slowly. So possibly a bottom to top approach would help rather than top to down. That's where you see nothing gets done because of the bureaucracy or lack of climate finance. Maybe sometime we should get some climate finance people join us, speak and say, see, there's policies, there are laws, there's science evidence. Okay, where's the money? Yeah, so not always. Some people, I mean, we can't blame the agencies or whoever policymakers for not doing something. It's because there's no money available. So then where does the law come from? How does it facilitate these kind of arrangements between the developing countries? So there's lots more bottlenecks. If you read into it, then it's a big question. It's really a Pandora's box. Oh my God, there's so much. But the objective is clear. The way to implement is difficult. So we need to synergize that, make it simplify and say in some form, we need to get them married and simplify the process for climate action. I think that's possible. Once the lawyers understand complete confidence in this and there's something to be done, then it's there. I think I can't get into that territory because it's not mine. It's to see how can we simplify it for better action.
So as a follow-up question to that, and please, everyone else, if you want to jump in, what type of climate services are needed, especially for the ASEAN region? And can you point us to a few best practices in terms of translating climate science to good policies that we can look onto?
Well, as I started mentioning this earlier in the webinar, one thing is higher institutional capacity. We need a higher local coordinating body because IPCC is global, you see, and they can be benefited. We can help the IPCC by forming a regional group. I know we have ASEAN, we have ASEAN membership group, we have plenty of other bodies, but we need a stronger cooperation, a stronger data exchange, and a tighter network, which I think is not much. As far as I know, as far as I've been in this region for so many years, we do not have a whole coordinating body as such. We need that so that they can locally look into the bottlenecks, locally look into the problem, because IPCC can't look into every region and everything. So we have our own problems, our own region, our own studies are limited. So we need, first of all, local coordinating body and enhanced data exchange. Not even data, just we say data and information exchange. What's being done? Can we share? Can we do this? Can we do this? And put them all together. Then there's somebody to identify the missing gaps and say, oh, climate services is a lot better here, probably in the European Union or somewhere and somewhere. So can we take some of them? So again, the lawyers come into the picture and say, why is some of these climate services working better, possibly in the European Union or somewhere? Why is it not here? Then you look into them and say, okay, this can be adjusted or something. Yeah, I think Dr. Roy has something to say.
Yeah, I can just give one example. You know, over all these years, 20 years for which I have been contributing to IPCC reports, I have seen how, say, initially I used to lead the chapter on industries. So what we used to do was convene a meeting between IPCC authors and the industry associations in different regions. This time for human settlements chapter, what has been done, IPCC authors and the, say, municipalities from different regions, municipal heads, they joined in a webinar. Now with the webinar, you know, it becomes more easy. You don't have to meet always physically. And so we wanted to know what is their requirement, what are the policies which is happening there. And that, as Raghavan has rightly said, we need to, I mean, there need to be a dialogue, right? Both the parties need to talk. So I'm just thinking that, so we do like the stakeholder consultation in different during the 5-year time. Besides government is the biggest stakeholder because we are intergovernmental panel, right? But we also consult the consumer forum, we also consult the businesses, we consult the industries, the municipalities. So maybe in 7th assessment report, I would urge maybe your institution and many other in your, I mean, you must be I mean, linked to many other law institutions where you can write to IPCC Secretariat. It's very easy. You can just write to the Secretary IPCC. You can get the email address, right? You can write that you want to have a stakeholder consultation with the IPCC authors when the 7th assessment report starts. Because I was listening to Petra and Elizabeth, and I found that there is so much of information which we need in the chapters of IPCC, you know. This is extremely important so that these can be integrated with the model runs and can be seen how much they are actually delivering. After IPCC report, we bring out the UNEP gap report also, where we try to show what is the gap, remaining gap, right? So in emission, in adaptation, like that. So these actions, how much they are delivering, that can also be estimated, right? So it's, if you see you can see that so much of action actually happening, which is very positive, but still it is falling far short. So how much short it is falling, that is important. So you can bring in those companies for the consultation. So stakeholder consultation is very much encouraged within the IPCC process. Just write an email to Secretary IPCC.
Now, hopefully with
you
this
might think
webinar,
that it is so simple. Yes, it is that simple, you know. And also the closed door meeting in IPCC makes us jargon free. They don't understand many jargon, and they say that, what does it mean? It doesn't mean anything to me. Someone else say that in my language, it has no meaning. Can you interpret it? So that's how this becomes more user-friendly language.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Roy. I think I will definitely be writing that email and taking up your suggestion. I really agree with your comments as well as that of Dr. Raghavan, especially in terms of like the gap in terms of coordination. And I see the gap also as a private sector, IPCC, private sector, university sort of gap. So just giving the example of shareholder resolutions, which I mentioned just now, there's quite a lack of clarity on how the precise IPCC pathway translates into what a particular company should do at, let's say, a particular plant level, or like an organizational wide level, or how this translates into the way it manages its subsidiaries. There may be some knowledge providers in that space, civil society is in that space, but once again, there could preferably be better coordination between, let's say, civil society and institutions, so academic institutions, which are looking at this very closely to translate the science into the way management actually occurs on the ground. And I think maybe another comment I would have also is that certainly there are obviously initiatives that regulators are already doing. On the ASEAN level, you have the ASEAN taxonomies, the newest version of which is just out, and that's quite progressive and seeks to also be looked at in alignment with other taxonomies per country within ASEAN. And one part of that taxonomy actually for the first time refers to managed coal phase out. So that is certainly, I think, maybe a step in terms of regional collaboration, but then where do the various actors within this all fit in? Because if you want to look at the way lawyers can work across the spectrum, you have obviously lawyers who work for regulators, you have lawyers who work for various parts of the private sector. The private sector obviously is not homogeneous. You have finances, you have companies, even between investors and specific companies themselves, they all have differing interests. So it definitely seems that a lot more information sharing needs to occur to speed up the process, because we don't have a lot of time, I think, to get this right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And another thing, just I think that this NUS Center for International Law, I'm using a strong word, you should write to the Singapore focal point, because there is a Singapore focal point for IPCC. You should write to him and seek an appointment one day and say that what you all are doing and you want to participate, you want to be nominated, some of your authors in the IPCC process. We have encouraged many, many institutions in different countries, and that has worked. The focal point is supposed to nominate the scientists, relevant scientists, to the IPCC technical support unit, right? And I see from your center, they can be actually nominated for international international policy chapter of IPCC in Working Group 3. That is important, right? So you all need to lobby with your focal point that how you can be included in the process, or how you can be heard in the national policy. Every country has to make a national communication to UNFCCC. So national institutions, so as I said, as Raghavan also said, it should be bottom up, right? It's not that focal point will have to find out who is where. You all need to write him almost every day, one letter from each faculty, say that I'm working on this. Have you seen this? This is my research paper. This might be useful for your NatCom. And that's how you get noted.
Thank you. We will definitely look into that. But yeah, hopefully the hope really is that this webinar is the first step towards greater coordination between the different sectors. If I may turn now to Professor Petra Minirop. This is a question actually that we got from the audience before the webinar started. So if you could just clarify, what exactly is the status of IPCC reports in international law? And for you and Elizabeth as well, do you anticipate any developments or evolution in the status given the continuing trend of climate litigation at domestic, regional, and international levels?
Thank you very much, Raya. So I've been listening to this discussion with great interest, and actually I can only confirm that I think we need to have this joint conversation between scientists and lawyers heard at all levels. This is so important to understand what we mean by attribution, even by causation. What do we mean by uncertainties? How do they play out in legal reasoning? So I think this is really useful also to hear that legal targets are so important, and this is also understood now more in the science community, because if we want to see change at scale over a broad range of issues in international environmental law, traditionally we needed to have a target. We can't just rely on private voluntary standard setting. We need to have, broadly applicable legal targets for each sector. Now, to your precise question, that is a really difficult one. I think in terms of the status of IPCC reports and all these invited reports, they're not imposed on the state community. They have been invited, as we have just heard. So the best argument to make would be to say that these are strong recommendations. And for example, if we see this enhanced focus, the reiteration of certain words, of a certain terminology, of certain targets in these IPCC reports that are then endorsed in COP decisions in these specific sections on science and urgency, I think there's a very, very strong argument to make that this is subsequent agreement on the interpretation of the treaty. So no longer do we understand 1.5 to 2 degrees, so ideally below 2, 1.5 we will never meet. No, we have a stronger focus on 1.5 degrees Celsius in the light of the latest available scientific knowledge, because the Paris Agreement was always meant to be, in that sense, an evolving treaty. It was towards a moving target where we knew that if new scientific evidence emerges, we may have to reconsider how we frame our national determined contribution in light of the goals of Article 2.1. So I think there's a strong argument to be made, and this would be very relevant because the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties sets forth certain elements or certain instruments for treaty interpretation, and finding a subsequent agreement of parties for the interpretation of the treaty is really crucial. This can even change the meaning of the treaty, and we've seen that even for the UN Charter to appear. So it's nothing that would be unique to climate change. And in that respect, I think it is also very important to have these close collaboration with the science and the legal community in all these key processes of the UNFCCC. And this includes, and we've touched upon the global stocktake already today, and this is why it's so important to have these submissions as well to the global stocktake and to be part of the process to ensure that the outcome of the global stocktake is something that is, again, legally meaningful and not just a recommendation, policy, guideline, perhaps something that can be set aside. It needs to be an output that hopefully states have to take forward as a matter of law and not just as a matter of goodwill.
I think perhaps just to add to that, and in terms of linking climate science to legal duties, this probably it wouldn't be a stretch to say that the legal duties of company directors, investors, the fiduciary duty content of these players who actually control the way businesses are run, it's quite reasonable to expect that running of that be tied to climate science, the latest, most updated climate science, which means that it's not just when you have court decisions or you have members of the judiciary who need to consider climate science across the whole spectrum. Any kind of decision maker who has particular legal obligations to make decisions responsibly when they run a company would also have to consider latest climate science in making their decisions. And I think that is maybe once again a disjunct where education in relation to the content of the IPCC and how that crystallizes into these legal obligations could be very helpful.
Yeah. I think one thing I'll add, if you go back, say, 20 years, 25 years, you will say that how local environmental laws came into effect. And there, actually, the policymakers used to attend many of our university classes, say, executive program, company heads used to come. So, there needs to be crash courses for them so that you make them aware. And being an NUS Center for International Law, you can do it, right? So you make sure with your climate change ministry that each and every department sends their executives for crash courses in your center, and you make them aware how these can be interpreted, how they can be, implemented, right? So this education is important. Like the company stakeholder you said, right? All did not respond because they are not aware of this. So education is a very important one, which in IPCC report this time we highlighted it very well. And so educational programs, educational curriculum, and educational institutions have a very, very important role to play. And for that, it should be a public good, right? So it should be the publicly funded or company funded or government funded educational program. So that's something, is also extremely important.
So as I was saying, it is a great segue to the next question, which was given to us by a member of the audience, asking how do we integrate science education with legal learning in the law school curriculum? And on the other hand, how do we integrate environmental laws in the science curriculum? So we mentioned how important it is to have like a bottom-up approach to all of this. And so if you could give like some examples, especially for the professors in our panel. Maybe we can start with Professor Petra.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's absolutely true. It's really important that we have, if not a university, pan-university course. I think this would be ideal if we had, all departments contributing to climate change education as a wider sustainability course for all students. At least in law schools, I think it's really important because lawyers can also sit on the wrong end when it comes to climate litigation. As there are always parties on both sides and strong arguments on both sides. So I think this making law students aware of their role and their potentially even driving role in this area is very important. And I think it's also important to have science as part of this, because you can't really teach climate law and policy without scientific input. So having maybe guest speakers or colleagues from the science departments having their say as well in such a course, I think this is very useful. We are teaching it actually now in Durham Law School, and it's been a very attractive course for students. They've really enjoyed it. So I think there's a lot that can be done.
I can just add one thing. Actually, in our classes, I'm not teaching law though. But what we try to do is that we actually use the IPCC reports themselves for teaching in the classes. We take some parts of it and then we reinterpret together, and that's how we do it. So the IPCC reports are all available in downloadable format. So you can download everything, every information, graphs, charts, and everything. So those become, and we have a very rich glossary. Glossary is used very, very carefully. So what does each term mean? That is also very important. You can find glossary there. So this can be the good starting point for the classroom teaching also.
Maybe there can be some clinical courses. So for example, following through on a research project with, let's say, a particular segment of industry or a particular institution or company as part of like a couple of months long research, and then that can potentially be graded. And then that would be like an amalgamation of legal obligations and how that works in practice to translate scientific analysis in everyday learning.
Yeah, like the case studies in the management schools.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
I think you're muted, Dr.
We can't hear you, Raghavan.
Maybe it's the...
Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah.
So the Department of Geography at NUS is going to start an MSc program on climate change and sustainability. So this is meant for different disciplines to come together, and we have framed a suite of modules now called courses that are open for the students to take. So that would cover climate science and those who come from physical geography, but also for those who come from the humanities. It consists some modules from law, from finance, from impacts, and then geopolitics and so on. So they get an entire gamut of all that they can possibly learn under this. So this is one way of doing it. And we also have this cross-discipline modules between departments. So what it means is there's a room for International Center for International Law and for some other departments to offer a course that sits for both of them. So the students from both departments or faculties can still do that. It'll be difficult for the scientists. I mean, if you put me through that, I will have difficulty because understanding the law, the terms, the jargons, it's difficult. And so it's for the science people to take that. And your question was two-sided, right? What is it meant for this, and this for this? So equally for the environmental law people or just to go and do the climate science would be equally difficult. But I think these kind of modules, which can be crafted on basics, simple jargons to get introduced. Yeah, so that's certainly possible. So the MSc is one program we're offering. There are other departments and faculties in NUS who have their own programs of sustainability and something. They have this interdisciplinary modules. That's one way to introduce them at this level, at the master's level.
Thank you. That's great. Actually, like to share, when I did my LLM as well on global environmental law, we had required subject on science for environmental lawyers, and it was so helpful.
Okay.
Like going back to the basics of what the water cycle is, things like that.
Sure.
What
Sure.
climate
Sure.
is so helpful. So I think on the other hand, like even for scientists having like that basic level of policy and legal education would be great as well.
Yeah,
So
it should be
those
great.
are,
Yes.
those are great
Yeah.
suggestions.
Yeah. Sure.
So your time is quickly running up. So I'll have a couple of last questions for all.
Just one small addition. In India, at some point of time, what they did, I think, which was a good policy, with World Bank capacity building program, what they did for environmental committee, which gives, which passes any project on environmental considerations, they needed to have a trained environmental economist at that point of time. Now it can be something like all such companies and everybody should have a trained climate change science taught course done, so that's kind of new job climate service need to happen, and they need to sit in everybody, in every legal bodies.
Yes. Okay, so their last few questions are, so first, how do you think the recently released AR6 will affect COP28? And as someone working on the intersection of policy and science and law, what are your key asks and wish list for COP28? Does anybody want to start?
Yeah, so there is a lot of discussion that so I would not say it's, so IPCC has produced the report, and now there are different knowledge institutions are trying to interpret it for COP28. And COP28, as you know, loss and damage is going to be a very important a topic for discussion, because COP27 started that, and in COP28, it needs to be negotiated, right? So there is huge work going on. And I'm sure that how do you really legally estimate and implement loss and damage will be a huge debate in COP28. So there is lots to do for all different stakeholders on this.
Yeah.
And maybe to add to that, I would like to see a very strong cover decision of COP28 that is in line with what I've tried to explain, the strong focus on the science and the urgency, hopefully also again, a strong focus on sea level rise and the oceans and potentially the cryosphere, because we are already committed to so much additional sea level rise simply because of the fragility in some of these ice sheets. So I think this would be a very good outcome if we could see a strong cover decision. And then in terms of the conclusion of the global stocktake, if there were a strong binding decision, or at least an operational part where it says the Conference of Parties decides, and there's some operational paragraphs that take seriously the language of Article 14 of the Paris Agreement, which I think was intended to be a legal oversight mechanism to really inform parties in terms of their next round of NDCs, and not just making a policy proposal or a suggestion to them. So really demanding from states, whether that is through their ICTU or in any other way or shape or form, when they submit the next round of NDCs, to demonstrate how they have taken on board the outcome of the global stocktake.
I think there will be higher nationally determined contributions. So countries will be committing, and once the countries commit higher target, they try to implement it within their country through different legal systems and through different stakeholders.
I actually have a question, I think, for the scientists on this panel, and that's whether or not you have an ambition for countries to make even higher targets for themselves in terms of NDCs? Because present NDCs, in your opinion, are they adequate to reach the pathways required? No, right? I thought there's some research
that can lead us to 3
Yeah.
degrees by
Right.
so I mean,
Yeah.
it's nowhere near, right? So
Right.
we are falling far short of that, and that is already very much in discussion, and that numbers are also known to every country, that how much we are falling short of. So every country has been urged to increase their NDCs. So countries are working towards that. Hopefully we should see more. So there needs to be more science and knowledge creation towards that, and more lobbying for that.
Right. Thank you. So I guess ambitiously, I would hope that that occurs and that translates into legislation for the private sector and guidance as well. Let's say mandatory requirements for transition plans.
Dr. Sri?
Which I think is already in place. Yeah, I think in 2020, I remember Singapore was the first to submit this NDC report and say that they're committed and they have their goals. So the ASEAN later, subsequently they submitted, but it takes a lot of effort. And also one of the big problems which we are not addressing in this webinar is climate financing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a huge topic which we should discuss. And so that puts off many things. And then if you look at the contributions, our targets of emissions, and there's a big missing gap. One of the big gap is who will fund that missing gap. So it's then the burden of the developed countries to fund the developing ones and say, okay, if they want to achieve this NDC, can you support them or something? So it's a big argument, big deliberation. The big people are already doing it. So it's worth reminding ourselves of that problem and the issues surrounding it.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'm so sorry, but our time is up. I see we have a couple of questions that we were not able to get into in the Q&A box. But once again, I'd love to thank our incredible panelists for sharing their expertise, and for our audience for their thoughtful questions and their attention throughout this webinar. As I mentioned earlier, the recording of the webinar will be available on the CIL website and on our YouTube page. And should you want to share them with your colleagues or your friends. Thank you, and I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you very much.
much.
Thank you.